think you're the governor? Die sal nie meer as hy af mine zoon.
The most painful betrayals are often born from our deepest sense of entitlement. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they had been deceiving you all along, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal their true intentions? That feeling of the ground shifting beneath your feet, of realizing too late that what you thought was yours by right was never truly secured. This is a story of arrogance, of cruelty paid back in kind, and of a deception so perfectly executed that it unfolded like a terrible symphony. Note, by agonizing note. Virginia, 1856. The Willoughby plantation stood as a monument to wealth accumulated through generations of forced labor, its pristine white columns gleaming in the southern sun while hiding the suffering that made such opulence possible. The broad tobacco fields stretched to the horizon, tended by over 100 enslaved souls whose sweat and blood had built the Willoughby fortune. At the center of this world stood Eleanor Willoughby, the mistress of the estate since her marriage to Thomas Willoughby, 15 years prior. She moved through the grand rooms with the confidence of someone who believed her position was ordained by both God and society, her silk gowns rustling against polished floors laid by enslaved craftsmen whose names she never bothered to learn. Eleanor had not been born to this wealth, the daughter of a modestly successful merchant. She had caught Thomas Willoughby's eye at a Richmond social gathering, her beauty and sharp wit elevating her from comfortable circumstances to extraordinary wealth through a marriage that many whispered had been beneath Thomas's station. Perhaps it was this very ascension that hardened something in Eleanor, making her determined to prove her worthiness through the perfect management of the household, and particularly through her treatment of the enslaved people she now commanded. Among them was Abigail, a domestic servant in her 30s who had been with the Willoughby family since childhood and who served as personal maid to Eleanor. Abigail moved through the great house with downcast eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts, her hands always busy, her voice soft and deferential as she attended to Eleanor's endless demands. Thomas Willoughby was a different sort of master than his wife, 20 years her senior. He had inherited the plantation from his father and grandfather before him, and something in that inheritance had given him a strange sense of responsibility that, while never challenging the institution of slavery itself, manifested as an unusual respect for certain enslaved individuals whose skills or character had impressed him. He consulted with the overseer rather than simply commanding, listened to suggestions about crop rotation from enslaved field workers who had worked the land for decades, and treated Abigail with a courtesy that Eleanor found both unnecessary and somewhat suspicious. The relationship between husband and wife had cooled over the years, particularly after it became clear that Eleanor would not provide the Willoughby name with an heir, a failure she felt keenly, and for which she blamed both her husband and, irrationally, Abigail, as though the servant could have somehow prevented this disappointment. The catalyst for what would follow came in the form of a letter delivered on a humid summer afternoon. Thomas had been coughing for months, a rasping sound that echoed through the house at night and which the local doctor had diagnosed as a serious illness of the lungs, prescribing rest and various tonics that seemed to provide little relief. The letter was from Thomas's lawyer in Richmond, responding to inquiries about the plantation's inheritance. Eleanor intercepted it, breaking the seal without hesitation, certain of her right to know all household business. What she read turned her world upside down. Thomas had apparently been making inquiries about Virginia law regarding manumission of enslaved people upon a master's death and the possibilities of including such individuals in his will. The lawyer's careful language made it clear that Thomas was considering not only freeing certain enslaved people, but possibly leaving them portions of his estate. The thought that any part of what Eleanor considered her rightful inheritance might be diverted to those she considered property ignited a rage in her that burned cold and calculating. She replaced the letter in its envelope and presented it to Thomas that evening as though she had not violated its privacy, watching his face carefully for signs of his intentions. She began her campaign that very night, subtle at first, questioning Thomas about his health, expressing concern while simultaneously emphasizing her own vulnerability should she be left alone. Who would manage such a large estate? How would she maintain her position in society as a widow? Surely he had made arrangements for her comfort and security. Thomas assured her that she would be well provided for, but something in his hesitation confirmed her suspicions. Over the following weeks, Eleanor's behavior toward the household slaves, particularly Abigail, took on a new dimension of cruelty. She found fault with everything, inflicting punishments for imagined infractions, making it clear to everyone that her authority was absolute. If Thomas noticed this change, he said nothing, perhaps too preoccupied with his worsening health and the arrangements he was secretly making. Abigail bore the brunt of Eleanor's displeasure with the same outward submission she had always shown, but something had changed in her eyes as well, a watchfulness, a careful observation of both mistress and master that might have alarmed Eleanor had she bothered to truly look at the woman who dressed her hair and prepared her bath each day. The turning point came when Eleanor overheard a conversation between Thomas and Abigail one afternoon, when they believed her to be visiting neighbors. Hidden behind the partially closed door of Thomas's study, she listened as her husband spoke to the enslaved woman with a familiarity that shocked her. They discussed his health, and then, most alarmingly, Thomas mentioned documents he had prepared, saying that Abigail should know where to find them should anything happen to him. When Abigail responded with gratitude, calling him Thomas rather than Master Willoughby, Eleanor nearly revealed herself in her outrage. Instead, she slipped away, her mind racing with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Was it possible that Abigail was more than a servant to Thomas? Could there have been a relationship that had continued right under her nose for years? And what documents could be so important that an enslaved woman needed to know their location? Eleanor's public humiliation of both her husband and Abigail began the next day at breakfast. With other household servants present, she questioned Thomas about his private meetings with Abigail, her tone making it clear what she suspected. Thomas attempted to dismiss her concerns, but Eleanor pressed on, describing how she had seen them together, exaggerating their physical proximity, suggesting impropriety in a way that caused the other servants to exchange glances. When Abigail entered the room, Eleanor turned her attention to her, asking loudly if she thought her position gave her special privileges, if she believed herself to be more than property, more perhaps even than a mistress of the house. Thomas ordered Eleanor to stop, his voice uncharacteristically sharp, which only confirmed Eleanor's suspicions in her own mind. The humiliations continued for days, escalating from insinuations to direct accusations. Eleanor ordered Abigail to be moved from the main house to the field quarters, a significant demotion for a domestic servant. When Thomas countermanded this order, Eleanor staged a scene in front of guests, suggesting that her husband valued an enslaved woman's comfort over his wife's wishes. She began locking away household items, claiming things had gone missing, her gaze fixed meaningfully on Abigail as she did so. Thomas's health deteriorated further under the strain of these conflicts, his coughing fits becoming more frequent and severe. The ultimate public humiliation came at a dinner party Eleanor insisted on hosting, despite Thomas's illness. With the county's most prominent families in attendance, she orchestrated a moment when Abigail would be called to bring a specific crystal decanter from the cabinet. Unknown to Abigail, Eleanor had placed it on a high shelf where it would be difficult to reach. As the servant stretched to retrieve it, Eleanor loudly commented on her familiarity with the household's best items, suggesting that perhaps Abigail considered herself entitled to them in some way. When the decanter slipped from Abigail's grasp and shattered on the floor, Eleanor seized the opportunity, ordering her to be whipped for the destruction of valuable property. The guests fell silent, uncomfortable with the display of personal household discipline at what should have been a social occasion. Thomas, pale and sweating with fever, rose from his seat and forbade the punishment, his public contradiction of his wife creating exactly the scandal Eleanor had intended. What Eleanor could not have anticipated was that this very public incident would accelerate Thomas's plans. That night, as Eleanor slept, satisfied with her day's work and asserting dominance, Thomas summoned his most trusted house servant, not Abigail, but an elderly man named Solomon, who had been with the Willoughby family for over 50 years. He entrusted Solomon with a sealed letter to be delivered immediately to his lawyer in Richmond, then called for Abigail. Despite his weakness, Thomas informed Abigail that he had completed the arrangements they had discussed and that the papers were now securely with his lawyer. If anything happened to him, she was to find a way to get to Richmond and present herself at the lawyer's office. When Abigail asked about Eleanor, Thomas merely shook his head, either unable or unwilling to consider what his wife's reaction would be. The following morning, Thomas Willoughby was found dead in his bed, his illness having finally claimed him. Eleanor's grief, such as it was quickly overshadowed by practical concerns about the estate and her future. She summoned the local magistrate, produced her marriage certificate and other papers establishing her rights as Thomas's widow, and began to take inventory of all she now considered unquestionably hers. She was therefore stunned when, 3 days after Thomas's burial in the family plot, a messenger arrived from Richmond with a letter requesting her presence at the reading of Thomas Willoughby's last will and testament. More shocking still was the instruction that Abigail was also to attend. Eleanor's first impulse was to refuse, to dismiss the request as some final strange whim of her husband's that could safely be ignored now that he was gone. But curiosity and concern about what Thomas might have arranged prevailed, and she ordered the carriage prepared, instructing that Abigail, ride outside with the driver, rather than inside with her. The journey to Richmond passed in tense silence, Eleanor rehearsing in her mind the various ways she would contest any attempt to divert her inheritance, Abigail gazing at the passing landscape with an expression that, had Eleanor bothered to notice, contained something very like hope. The lawyer's office was austere, its walls lined with leather-bound books, the smell of paper and ink heavy in the air. Eleanor took the offered chair with the confidence of her position, while Abigail stood against the wall, seemingly invisible to everyone but the lawyer, who acknowledged her presence with a slight nod. The reading of the will began conventionally enough, with Thomas leaving specific items to various relatives and associates. Eleanor relaxed somewhat, assuming the bulk of the estate would naturally come to her. When the lawyer paused, adjusted his spectacles, and announced that he was now moving to the portions of the will that were unusual and might require some explanation, Eleanor felt her confidence begin to waver. Thomas Willoughby, the lawyer explained, had left his wife a life interest in the plantation house and a modest annual income, sufficient for her to live comfortably but not lavishly. The majority of the estate, however, including the land, the enslaved workers, and the business interests, had been placed in a trust. The terms of this trust were extraordinary. 1/3 of the annual profits would go to Eleanor during her lifetime, another third would be reinvested in the estate, and the final third would be set aside. Upon Eleanor's death, the entire estate would be liquidated, the enslaved people would be manumitted, and the proceeds would be divided among them according to a formula based on their years of service to the Willoughby family. But there was more. Thomas had made one exception to this arrangement. Abigail was to be freed immediately, and a substantial sum, $17,000, a fortune by any standard, was to be given to her directly. The reason for this special treatment was contained in a sealed letter which the lawyer now produced. With Eleanor watching in growing horror, he broke the seal and read Thomas's private words. Abigail, the letter revealed, was Thomas Willoughby's daughter, born to an enslaved woman with whom his father had had a long relationship. Thomas had known of her existence since his own father's death, when he had discovered papers acknowledging her paternity. Unable to openly claim her as his sister, due to the strictures of Virginia society and law, he had kept her close, protecting her as best he could, while maintaining the fiction that she was merely another piece of property. Eleanor's humiliation was now complete. The woman she had treated with such contempt, whom she had suspected of being her husband's mistress, was in fact his sister, a Willoughby by blood if not by law. The fortune she had thought securely hers was to be shared not only with Abigail, but eventually with every person she had considered mere property. As the lawyer continued reading, explaining the complex legal arrangements Thomas had made to ensure his wishes would be difficult to contest, Eleanor felt the room begin to spin around her. The carefully constructed world in which she had been the unquestioned mistress, superior to all around her by virtue of her marriage and race, collapsed in an instant. Abigail's reaction was contained, her years of practiced self-control allowing her to receive this extraordinary news with outward calm. But the lawyer noted a single tear tracking down her cheek, quickly wiped away, as she learned that the brother who could never acknowledge her publicly had found a way to recognize her in death. When asked if she understood the provisions made for her, Abigail spoke for the first time since entering the office, her voice clear and steady. She understood perfectly, she said, and would honor her brother's memory by using her newfound freedom and resources wisely. As for Eleanor, the journey back to the plantation was one of bitter reflection. The servants who had witnessed her cruelty, who had been forced to participate in her humiliation of Abigail, had known or suspected the truth all along. Every calculated slight, every public dressing down she had inflicted had been observed and remembered by people who would one day be free, who would share in the wealth she had considered exclusively hers. Her power over them was temporary, her authority diminished by the knowledge that Thomas had valued them, had seen them as people deserving of a future she had never imagined for them. Abigail did not return to the plantation. With the lawyer's assistance, she established herself in Philadelphia, where she opened a small school for children of color. She never spoke publicly of her relationship to the Willoughby family, but she wrote regularly to Solomon and others, still at the plantation, letters that were passed from hand to hand, read aloud in whispered gatherings, sustaining hope through the difficult years that followed. Eleanor lived another 17 years, watching as the Civil War and its aftermath transformed the society she had known. She died in 1878, having witnessed the legal emancipation that Thomas had attempted to provide on a smaller scale. True to the terms of his will, the Willoughby plantation was sold, and the proceeds distributed among the former enslaved people who had worked the land, many of whom used their shares to purchase their own small farms or establish businesses. In the end, What Eleanor failed to understand was that true betrayal lies not in the concealment of truth, but in the refusal to recognize the humanity in others. Her husband, and the woman she had humiliated, had shared not a secret love, but a secret blood, a connection that transcended the artificial boundaries of slavery. The inheritance they eventually shared was not just one of money and land, but of a vision for a different future, one that Eleanor, blinded by her own sense of entitlement and superiority, could never comprehend. Have these stories of betrayal and resistance resonated with something in your own experience? Perhaps you've felt the sting of discovering that what you believed was yours by right had been built on foundations you never truly examined. Or maybe you've been the one forced to hide your true self, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows of others' expectations. These are not just tales from a distant past, but echoes that still reverberate through our shared history, reminding us that the masks we wear and the roles we play are often more complex than they appear. If these explorations of our complicated human past speak to you, I invite you to join our community by subscribing to this channel. Each week, we delve into forgotten stories that illuminate the struggles, resistances, and occasional triumphs of those whose voices have been silenced in traditional historical accounts. This isn't just about learning history, it's about honoring memories and recognizing the long shadows that still fall across our present. Click subscribe and continue this journey of discovery with us as we uncover the hidden truths that help us understand not just where we came from, but who we truly are.